It's time to start your morning by taking 5. Here's your host, Matt McMaster.
You're listening to Take 5, a quick 5-minute take on the biggest things happening in Nebraska sports. I'm your host, Matt McMaster. A really great piece of content came out yesterday, including Nebraska football's head coach, Matt Rhule, who did an interview with college football journalist, reporter, personality, whatever you want to call him, Josh Pate. It was a 57-minute interview. It went really, really well. The feedback from people in the YouTube comments about Matt Rhule, who didn't really know too much about Matt Rhule, who didn't know too much about the Nebraska football program as of right now, were incredibly positive. And if you're someone who's been following this program and following Matt Rhule through his press conferences and his media appearances, I don't think this is any sort of surprise in terms of his performance and how well he looked. And he did touch on a lot of things that he's talked about earlier before. He's talked about the tampering of the spring game, him not wanting to do a spring game with the panic, not the panic, but the worry that other teams would tamper with his players, pick his players off his team because of a televised spring game. And that happened last year. He mentioned how there were dudes who were being contacted by other teams, not because of their performance in the fall, but because of their performance in the spring. He talked about how he doesn't like the 105 rule just because he's a walk-on, and Corey Campbell, his strength coach, is a walk-on, and he just feels that the elimination of the walk-on program just is not good for college football, and getting rid of kids who really are there at a school to just play ball is not a great thing for the game. But he did mention some other things that he hasn't talked about before. One of the biggest things that, he had two really big points. The first really big point was he believes that in the next couple of years, Josh Pate kind of threw the year 2030 around, that there should be a group of 40 teams, regardless of what conference they're currently in right now, grouped together, and that should be considered the main group of college football teams. And what Coach Rhule basically described that would put teams into that category, that large category of teams in Tier 1, would be if they're giving enough resources, if they're trying to compete at the highest level of football. Because the matter of the fact is that, yes, some teams have really, really good years. Some smaller programs can put together really good recruiting classes, have one great go at it, take a big swing, have an awesome season. The first one that you can kind of think of is the Cincinnati teams under Luke Fickell really embodied that, how a non-Power 5 team can have some great classes with great players and go out and compete at the highest level. But he believes that, other than those flash in the pans, the teams that are consistently at the top are the ones who put in the most effort, who put in the most resources, who take the game the most seriously. And he believes, and made a very, very bold statement, that he believes those teams should be grouped together in one, and that should be the main league, essentially, that should be competing in college football. Another thing that he talked about was how he's adapted as a coach and how players getting picked from him in the transfer portal, coaches leaving him to other teams and whatnot, kind of set his competitive edge, got him going a little bit more, made him adapt to the transfer portal, made him realize that there are things, and admitted that there are things that he does now as a coach that he wouldn't have done a couple of years ago. And I really admire that perspective from head coach Matt Rhule, because he has a lot of macro thoughts. But I always appreciate the fact that it always comes back to Nebraska. It always comes back to micro. What's happening around him, he's always thinking about, how does this affect my team? How does this affect how Nebraska is going to be competing in the future? And I think that is a really positive mindset for this program to have. But my criticism of all this is, if you're going to say big words and throw big ideas around and swing a big stick in media appearances and in opinions, you have to swing a big stick on the football field. And it worries me a little bit that Matt Rhule has not had success here at Nebraska. I mean, let's just bare bones. I mean, they went 6-6. They won a bowl game. It was really good. They had a good couple of months in the transfer portal and getting coaches. But on a macro level, they haven't had a ton of success. And these are really big words and really big ideas. And you're talking about excluding college football programs from being able to win a national championship. It's words that some programs and some fans of programs may feel targeted by his comments and may not like the idea of not being included in the big boy table, and not like the idea that Nebraska, who until recently hadn't made a bowl game in 8 years, they get to be included at the big boy table. And I just think some of those things and some of those thoughts at times puts him in the crosshairs of people in college football, puts him in the crosshairs of whether it be coaches or fans or media members. And if he was winning games consistently, 10-2, 9-3, maybe even 8-4, if he was a consistent winner, I would have no problem with my coach airing these messages. I have a slight problem with a coach who's had one winning season in 2 years and barely made a bowl game last year saying these things. It's what he believes. He's going to say what he believes. I'm not going to take anything away from that. You got to say, if you're going to say these words, you got to perform on the football field. And saying these words puts a little bit more pressure on performing at that level. We'll see if he can do it. All signs are pointing that he can. When you look at the roster with how they constructed it, when you look at the coaching staff, all signs are pointing that he is going to be able to swing that big stick when it comes to August and October and November and December. But we'll see what happens. And it's one of those things where I think a lot of people appreciate his thoughts. A lot of people appreciate his honesty. But you don't want to be the guy that puts the target on your back before you've made some big plays. And that's kind of what he's done to an extent. But at the same time, I think these are words that need to be heard by a lot of people in college football. That's been Take 5. I've been your host, Matt McMaster.